The air is thick. A sweet, cloying stench of rot and disease. You have forgotten the feeling of clean skin. You have forgotten the taste of real food. You are a prisoner of war. The men who captured you are devils. Horned, bloodthirsty monsters from across the sea. This is what you have been taught your entire life. They lead you, trembling and filthy, into a cold, concrete room. Pipes run overhead, nozzles point down, your heart seizes. You know what this is. The end your leaders promised. A dishonorable death in a gas chamber. You close your eyes, you wait for the hiss of poison. But what comes out is not death, it's water, and it is hot. This is the story of a moment so simple, yet so profound, it shattered an empire's worldview. If you are fascinated by the hidden stories that change history, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Our story begins through the eyes of a woman we will call Akiko Tanaka. Her experience is woven from the diaries and testimonies of Japanese women interned by Allied forces in the final year of the Pacific War. Before the war, Akiko was a nurse in Nagasaki. Her world was one of order, the antiseptic smell of the hospital, the aroma of green tea in the morning, the fragrance of cherry blossoms in the spring. It was a world governed by duty and the unquestionable divinity of the emperor, and it was a world saturated with propaganda. From childhood, Akiko was taught about the Kichiku Beihei, the American and British devil beasts. Posters showed them as monsters kidnapping women and destroying temples. Newsreels spoke of their barbarism. The military government assured the people that capture was a fate worse than death. The code of Bushido was twisted into a national mandate: fight to the last person. Never surrender, death before dishonor. For Akiko, these were not slogans, they were the truth. Then, the truth burned. The war came home not as glorious news, but as fire from the sky. Akiko was transferred to a field hospital on Saipan, an island fortress. Here, her world of clean linen vanished. It was replaced by a humid, stinking hell. The air was a cocktail of cordite, blood, and gangrene. The ground trembled day and night from American naval bombardments. Food became a distant memory. A single ball of watery rice was a feast. Hunger was a constant, gnawing ache. She wrote in a hidden diary, a small ledger tucked in her uniform. Day 52. The shelling does not stop. We ran out of bandages a week ago. We use boiled rags. The screams of the men do not sound human anymore. The flies are everywhere. I saw a soldier, no older than my brother, choose a grenade over our help. He smiled at me and said, "For the Emperor. I do not feel honor. I only feel the emptiness in my stomach." Then came the invasion. The American Marines landed. The fighting was apocalyptic. The Japanese command, knowing the battle was lost, enacted its final order. Civilians were told to commit suicide rather than be captured. It was the ultimate test of loyalty. Thousands obeyed, jumping from the island's high cliffs. Akiko and a group of nurses hid in a cave. They huddled in the dark, listening as the battle drew closer, starving, sick, and paralyzed by fear. The choice was clear: a grenade or the devils. When the moment came, shadows of giant men with strange rifles fell across the cave mouth. Akiko's survival instinct screamed louder than any propaganda. They were found cowering, covered in grime and lice, their bones jutting out from beneath tattered clothes. The devils had arrived. The American soldiers were huge, taller and broader than any man Akiko had ever seen. They did not shout. Their voices were low, speaking a language that sounded like tumbling rocks. They smelled of sweat, tobacco, and a strange sweet soap. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, offered her a small metal bar from his rations, a chocolate bar. Akiko flinched, believing it was poison. He unwrapped it, broke off a piece, and ate it himself to show her it was safe. This was the first crack in her reality. Devils did not share their food. The prisoners were herded onto trucks. The fear was still absolute. They were driven to a newly constructed camp, a city of tents surrounded by barbed wire. This, they thought, is where the torture will begin. They were lined up. Stripped of their filthy rags, a moment of profound humiliation. Sprayed with a harsh, chemical-smelling delousing powder. A tear rolled down Akiko's cheek. This was it, the dehumanization before the slaughter. Then, a female officer, through a translator, pointed them toward a long, concrete building. Showers, the translator said. The word hung in the air, thick with dread. They had all heard the rumors from the war in Europe, of poison gas disguised as a cleansing ritual. They were pushed inside. The room was cold, gray, and stark. Pipes ran along the ceiling. They huddled together, a mass of shivering, terrified humanity. Akiko grabbed the hand of the woman next to her. This was the end. A final, cruel deception. To be gassed like insects, naked and ashamed. She thought of the cherry blossoms in Nagasaki. A loud clank echoed as a valve was turned. Then, a hiss. Water slammed against their bodies, a collective gasp of shock. Not terror, it was just water. And then something changed. The hiss from the pipes deepened. The icy sting faded. It was replaced by a pleasant warmth. And then it was hot. Gloriously, impossibly hot. Steam began to rise from the concrete floor. The women began to weep. It was a sound of absolute, soul-shattering release. Women collapsed to their knees, letting the water pour over their heads. Their faces turned to the ceiling. They scrubbed at their skin, watching months of filth and dried blood wash away. Akiko stood frozen, just feeling it. The heat seeped into her bones. This single, simple act was more powerful than any weapon. The carefully constructed image of the American devil was dissolving in the steam. Beasts do not warm their victims. Devils do not grant the dignity of being clean. In that concrete room, Akiko's world broke in two. There was the world she had been told, and the world she was now feeling on her own skin. They could not both be true. After the shower, they were given clean cotton clothes, and then they were fed. Not a rice ball. Thick slices of soft white bread, a strange, salty paste they would later learn was peanut butter, and a can of peaches in sweet syrup. The sweetness was a shock, a taste of a forgotten world of abundance. She sat, clean and clothed, a can of peaches in her lap. Her own government had demanded her death. These devils had given her hot water and sweet fruit. One of them had to be a lie. But which one? The days that followed were a blur of structured strangeness. The sun would rise, and there was no shelling. There was only the sound of a distant generator and the murmur of English. The prisoners fell into a routine, a rhythm of survival that was no longer about dodging death, but about navigating confusion. The food was a constant source of shock. That salty, sticky paste appeared at most meals. Peanut butter. The women would poke it with their fingers, unsure of its purpose. Some tried to mix it into their rice, a disastrous combination. Others ate it plain, the rich, fatty taste coating their mouths, a world away from the thin, watery broths they had survived on. They watched the American guards with a mixture of fear and fascination. These giants, these devils, were bored. They played a strange game, hitting a small, hard ball with a wooden club. They would shout and laugh, their bodies moving with a lazy, powerful grace. They called it baseball. To Akiko, it was a ritual of wasted energy. How could they afford to play when there was a war on? The answer was everywhere she looked. It was in the endless supply of canned food stacked in wooden crates. It was in the fuel that powered the trucks and generators. It was in the sheer volume of their trash. One afternoon, a guard tossed an empty Coca-Cola bottle into a bin. The thick green glass glinted in the sun. Akiko had seen another prisoner secretly retrieve one, treating it like a precious jewel, a perfect vessel for holding water. The Americans simply threw them away. This was not the behavior of an enemy on the verge of collapse, as the propaganda had promised. This was the casual carelessness of infinite abundance. Historical records show that in 1944, the United States was producing one military aircraft every 5 minutes. Japan's entire industrial output was a fraction of America's. The prisoners did not know the numbers, but they could see the truth in a discarded glass bottle. The most profound weapon was the medicine. A camp doctor, a quiet man with weary eyes, treated the prisoners. Wounds, he had penicillin, he had sulfa powder. He cleaned infections that would have meant certain amputation or a slow, agonizing death just weeks before. He worked with a gentle efficiency that was utterly disarming. Akiko, the nurse, watched him, her own medical training feeling primitive and useless. Her government had given her boiled rags and patriotic slogans. The enemy gave her sterile bandages and miracle drugs. One day, a new group of prisoners arrived. Captured on a nearby island, they were skeletal. Their eyes were wide with the madness of prolonged starvation. As the camp staff fed them, Akiko overheard a translator talking to one of the new women. The woman wept, describing the conditions back in Japan. The firebombings had turned cities to ash, food rations were cut again and again. The people were eating acorns and tree bark. The military police were arresting anyone who spoke of peace. A Red Cross report from that period confirmed it. The average daily caloric intake for a civilian in Tokyo had fallen below 1,500 calories. In the camp, Akiko and the others were receiving nearly double that. They were prisoners, and they were healthier than their free families back home. If you are finding this story as unbelievable as they did, take a moment to subscribe. The most powerful truths in history are often the most ironic. The realization settled over Akiko like a physical weight. Every can of peaches, every slice of bread was a testament to a lie. Her leaders had spoken of spiritual superiority, of the purity of the Japanese soul triumphing over the enemy's crude materialism. But that spirit was being starved into submission. That purity was being consumed by fire. Here, in a cage built by the enemy, she was being kept alive by the very materialism they were supposed to despise. The abundance was not just a tool of war. It was the entire point. The Americans were not winning because they were devils. They were winning because they had peanut butter. The conflict inside her was a silent, raging storm. To accept this kindness felt like a betrayal. Every bite of food was a treasonous act against the emperor, against her starving family, against the boy who chose a grenade over her help. Yet the instinct to live was overwhelming. It was a physical thing, a deep, primal command from her own body to eat, to heal, to survive. Her loyalty was to a nation that had ordered her to die. Her survival depended on an enemy that insisted she live. One evening, a guard brought out a phonograph. He placed a black disc on the turntable and a needle in the groove. A sound filled the night air. It was not a military march or a traditional folk song. It was a wild, chaotic river of noise. A wailing saxophone, a dancing piano, a syncopated drum beat. Jazz. The music was decadent, emotional, and impossibly free. It was the sound of a world that did not fear chaos. Akiko watched the faces of the other prisoners. Some looked horrified. Others were mesmerized. She saw a young girl, no older than 10, tapping her bare foot in time with the rhythm. Akiko looked past the girl, toward the barbed wire fence that circled the camp. Beyond it, the jungle was dark and silent. In her mind, she saw Japan, a land of ghosts and ashes, bound by a code of honor that demanded extinction. She looked back inside the wire, at the well-fed children, the clean clothes, the strange, vibrant music. The fence was no longer a symbol of her imprisonment. It had become the opposite. She realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the wire was not there to keep her in. It was there to keep the horror of her own country out. The kindness was relentless. It was systematic. Akiko soon understood that the hot water and the peaches were not random acts of mercy. They were the opening shots in a new kind of war, a war for her mind. The Americans began a formal program of what they called re-education. It began in a large tent, with a projector and a screen, just like the movie night. But this time, there were no smiling dancers. The first film was silent, except for the whirring of the projector. It showed factories, endless assembly lines of machines and people. Rivers of molten steel poured into molds. A man in the film stamped a sheet of metal, and a caption appeared on the screen. Ford Motor Company, Detroit. One B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Then, another factory, shipyards. Enormous gray hulls sliding into the water. A new naval destroyer launched every week. The film went on and on. A hypnotic, terrifying display of industrial might. Statistics flashed on the screen. In 1944, the United States produced over 40 billion rounds of ammunition. Japan produced less than 2 billion. The Americans built more than 96,000 military aircraft. Japan built 28,000. Akiko sat in the dark, the numbers burning into her brain. She thought of the boiled rags in her field hospital. She thought of the single grenade given to soldiers who had no rifle. The propaganda had spoken of Japan's spiritual strength overcoming America's material wealth. But this was not wealth. This was a force of nature. It was an avalanche of steel that was burying her homeland. The war was not a contest of spirit. It was a simple, brutal equation of production, and her side had already lost. The next screening was worse. The camp administrators showed them captured Japanese newsreels, films made by their own government, for their own soldiers. They showed the Imperial Army's entry into the Chinese city of Nanking. They showed Japanese soldiers laughing as they used prisoners for bayonet practice. They showed the, quote, comfort women, Korean and Chinese girls forced into military brothels. They showed film of Allied prisoners of war, starved and beaten, their bodies like skeletons. The tent was silent, no one moved. Akiko felt a wave of nausea. This was the honor of the emperor. This was the divine mission of her people. It was a lie, a monstrous, bloody lie. She looked at the faces of the American guards standing by the tent flap. They were not watching the screen, they were watching the prisoners, their expressions unreadable. They were not devils, they were witnesses. The devils were the men on the screen, her men. The camp's fragile peace shattered. The truth was a poison. Some women screamed that the films were fake, American tricks. Others retreated into a catatonic silence. Fights broke out over rations, old loyalties, and new fears turning into bitter accusations. One night, 2 older women were found hanging from the rafters of a latrine. They had twisted their own clothes into ropes. They left no note. Their suicide was not an act of defiance for the emperor. It was an escape from a truth too terrible to bear. Akiko wrote in her diary, "My soul is a burnt thing. I do not know who I am. To be Japanese is to be this. I look at my hands and I see the hands of a monster." Her dilemma became the air she breathed. Every day was a choice. The old world demanded an honorable death. To die for the emperor, for a nation that was pure and divine, was the highest calling. But that world was a fantasy. The real Japan was the one on the screen, a nation that was starving its own people and committing unspeakable crimes. To die for that was not honor, it was madness. The new world, the world inside the wire, offered something else. Not honor, but dignity. The dignity of a clean body, the dignity of a full stomach, the dignity of surviving. But to choose survival felt like the ultimate betrayal. It was an admission that everything she had ever believed in was wrong. It meant turning her back on her family, her ancestors, her very identity. She saw the boy with the grenade in her dreams. He was no longer smiling. He was pointing at her, his eyes accusing. Traitor. Then came the letters. The Americans brought in a Nisei translator, an American-born man of Japanese descent. He read from letters they had found on the bodies of Japanese soldiers. These were not the glorious final testaments the government published in the newspapers. They were the last, desperate words of frightened boys. One wrote to his mother about the worms in the rice and the constant diarrhea. Another begged his wife to tell their son he was brave, even though he was terrified. Another just wrote the word hungry, over and over again, until the ink trailed off the page. Hearing these words, Akiko's rage and shame gave way to a profound, bottomless sorrow. These soldiers were not divine warriors. They were victims, just like her. They had been fed the same lies, starved by the same leaders, and sent to die for a fantasy. The enemy was not the man with the chocolate bar. The enemy was the man who had sent them all to this island to die. One morning, the camp commandant made an announcement through the translator. A new program was beginning. The Americans were looking for volunteers, for prisoners who were willing to help them write leaflets and record radio broadcasts to be sent to Japan. Messages telling the people the truth about the war. Telling them that surrender was not dishonor. That the Americans offered food and medicine, not torture and death. The translator held up a clipboard. He said, "We are making a list. Anyone who helps will be given better rations, a private room. They will be at the top of the list for repatriation when the war is over." He looked out at the silent crowd of skeletal women. His gaze seemed to find Akiko's. The choice was no longer a philosophical debate inside her head. It was a question, hanging in the humid air. A list. It was a line drawn in the dirt. On one side was everything she had ever been. On the other was a chance to live. The translator held out his pen. "Who wants to be first?" Akiko looked at the pen. A simple black pen in a stranger's hand. It held more power than any rifle. It was a key and a sword. A key to a future she could not imagine. and a sword that would sever her from everything she had ever known. The silence in the crowd was a living thing. It was thick with fear, suspicion, and the weight of generations of duty. She felt the eyes of the other women on her. She saw the boy with the grenade in her mind. Traitor! She took a single step forward. The sound of her bare foot on the dirt was as loud as a gunshot. Her work began in a small tent, away from the others. She did not write of grand strategy or politics. She wrote about the small, undeniable truths. She wrote about the taste of peanut butter. She described the heat of the water in the showers. She wrote about the American doctor who cleaned a child's infected wound, his hands gentle and sure. She recorded her voice, speaking in quiet, simple Japanese. Her words beamed across the ocean into a homeland that believed she was dead. Each word was a betrayal. Each word was also an act of survival. An act, she tried to convince herself, of a different kind of mercy. When the war finally ended, the news arrived not with a bang, but as a quiet rumor that solidified into unbelievable fact. The Emperor, the living God, had spoken on the radio. He had used the voice of a mortal man to announce their surrender. For Akiko and the others in the camp, it was the end of one kind of imprisonment and the beginning of another. Repatriation was a journey into a ghost world. She returned to a Nagasaki that was no longer a city, but a scar on the face of the earth. The cherry blossoms were gone. Everything was gone. Her family was gone. She was a survivor, but there was no celebration. People who had been prisoners were not heroes. They were sources of shame. They were the ones who had failed to die. Her neighbors, gaunt and dressed in rags, would avert their eyes. No one asked her what it was like. To have lived when so many had perished was an accusation. Her survival was a stain on their collective honor. She was given a room in a crowded boarding house. She found work in a clinic, overwhelmed with the sick and the dying. One evening she went to a public bathhouse, one of the few structures still standing. She lowered herself into the steaming water. It was a familiar comfort, a ritual from her old life. But as the heat seeped into her bones, the memory of that concrete shower room returned. In the camp, the hot water had been a shocking act of humanity from an enemy she thought was a devil. It had shattered her world of lies. Here, back in the land she was supposed to have died for, the water was just water. And the silence from the people around her was colder than any prison. She finally understood the deepest, most paradoxical truth of her war. The Americans had not conquered her body with their weapons. They had conquered her soul with a single, incomprehensible act of kindness. The greatest trauma was not the horror of the battle. It was not the hunger or the fear. It was the mercy. It was the realization that her enemy had shown her more humanity than her own leaders. She had been saved by the devils, only to return home and find herself a stranger among her own people. Her life had been given back to her, but her identity had been taken forever, washed away in a stream of hot water. What part of this story shocked you the most? The propaganda, the cruelty, or the unexpected weapon of kindness? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe these hidden histories need to be told, please like this video and subscribe for more.